Hey everybody, welcome back to Video Game Mess. So today I got a fun and exciting video for you guys today because I'm going over Sega Saturn Emulation again. That is because Ymir 0.30 is in testing and the code is available on GitHub right now. In the past I have told you Ymir or Ymir, depending on how you want to pronounce it, is quickly becoming my favorite Sega Saturn emulator and getting very close to being my de facto choice for the best Saturn emulator out there. And now with this new playtest version, it isn't hit mainstream yet, but it definitely is very reliable. You're going to be getting even better Sega Saturn emulation, more improvements and enhancements, and just an overall more stable experience. And considering how difficult Sega Saturn emulation is, and the fact that MedDefend, while extremely accurate, can be quite difficult for people to use, having something like Ymir be so easy to just get playing games, absolutely a big asset for the Sega Saturn fan community. Before you get too far involved though, do me a huge favor down below, hit like and subscribe and ring that notification bell, definitely helps us out. And if you feel so inclined and want to support the channel, there's a Patreon link down below as well. And I'm playing Waku Waku 7 here because it's one of the games that has improved with the most recent version of Ymir. The sprites used to flash a ton more, and it would be maybe still playable, but definitely a little bit strange. And it's one of those things, Sega Saturn absolutely is having a resurgence. We have the MiSTer FPGA core, we have Ymir emulation, and more people are discovering Sega Saturn games every day. So having another Sega Saturn emulation option on the market out there for you to play around with is definitely something that is hugely important. And I have heard rumors that maybe a new version of Ymir might even bring in some graphical enhancements on the GPU side of things, but nothing really to show or talk about quite yet. Just be aware that is something that is apparently in the cards. Additionally, there is better mouse support here for light guns, and just so you know, I am playing with my trackball because as a film editor, I use a very large Kensington mouse with 4 buttons, a whole scroll wheel, as well as a massive trackball in the center. If you notice, it seems very smooth and very stable when I'm not moving it. That is because I am using that trackball, not a D-pad for the testing. And it's one of those things I absolutely just cannot use a regular mouse at this point in time unless I am playing a first-person shooter game, then I plug in a standard mouse, because honestly, trackballs really aren't that great for it. But since we first started talking about Ymir, maybe a year or so ago, this emulator's absolutely just been speed running Saturn emulation developments. It went from basically loading up like 3 games with corrupted graphics at 4 frames per second to now basically running near to the entire Sega Saturn library, a lot of times without any visual glitches whatsoever. And that is a testament to just how good the developer on this striker has done. And really 2026 has been a hot year for video game emulation in general, and it's why I keep saying on the channel, this is why retro gaming is making a comeback. We have so many new emulators, so many updates to existing emulators. Basically there isn't a platform out there that if you want to play games on it via your PC and emulation, you can't do that. And one of those things, retro gaming emulation is always getting better and better, and I always keep getting asked questions, what is the best emulator for every retro gaming platform? And I will have a video soon talking about exactly that, because trust me, even if you have emulation set up, a lot of people are jumping in now. So you'll see as of yesterday, the latest nightly release, if you go onto GitHub, you can grab this right now, and if you click the build log, you're going to see what's going on in version 0.3.0. This is still in active development, so not everything is going to be stable, but honestly, in my testing experience, I had no issues whatsoever, so there really isn't anything I could personally point to say that might not be working exactly as you would want it to. And you'll see here on the updates, the input capture method for light guns and mouse peripherals, they have been added in for support, and that's going to make a big difference. Also, there's going to be a lot of other changes. I'll let you read through all of those in your spare time if you want. But if you want the TLDR, Sega Saturn emulation keeps getting better. Ymir keeps making it better. And honestly, I feel like by maybe the end of this year, you will have stuff like 100% compatibility and maybe even graphical enhancements. Because if we're being entirely honest, Sega Saturn could definitely use a little bit of a leg up in the visual department. The same way DuckStation has all of the enhancements for PlayStation 1, I would love to see something very similar come in to Ymir, because I think it would just make more people be willing to play Sega Saturn games if they did not grow up with them. Because if I'm being entirely honest, if you have nostalgia for something like the House of the Dead on Sega Saturn, that is awesome, but it's definitely a way uglier version of the game than the Sega Model 2 original. But if we could get to a better graphical standard with enhancements in the future, that would be great. Let's go over to the first 2 soundtrack samples so you can hear the audio quality in Ymir, and I'll be right back with a lot more Sega Saturn tests. Not only does Nights into Dreams have one of the best soundtracks as far as the cheery and bright sounding sounds on Saturn is concerned, it's also an excellent test because if you haven't played many Saturn games, I feel like you've definitely played Nights into Dreams. And as far as the emulation here, as far as the speed of the performance, the graphical rendering, the music, having basically no latency whatsoever in the controls, I could sit here and play Nights into Dreams all day long on Ymir, and that really is what you want. You know I love talking about emulation developments, and a lot of times I say how things get done is more exciting to me than the final product, but at the end of the day, when you sit down to emulate a retro game, you don't really want to be thinking about the technology underlying how everything works. You don't want to be thinking about a lot of the setup. You just want to sit down and play a game and have fun like you did back in the day, because the only reason software emulation exists for retro gaming is because people want to continue to play these games, even including not having the real hardware anymore for it. So it's important that the experience just basically feels like you're playing a Sega Saturn, except you're playing it in a lot crisper resolution, just because you're obviously not having to deal with modifying your Saturn outside of RGB. Because don't get me wrong, the RGB quality on a Sega Saturn is the best RGB quality we ever got on a console, but being able to render this on your computer and being able to have HDMI out into a TV is just that much better. And honestly, Nights into Dreams is 10 out of 10, no notes whatsoever. I did not have a single issue with it. Now there is a de-interlacing mode in actual Ymir, and that's definitely going to work sometimes and not work other times. If you see here on Virtua Fighter 2, if I go in and de-interlace the video, you get these strange black lines. So hopefully that gets improved soon. It's one of those things, I've seen it work in some games, but Virtua Fighter 2 for some reason just decided it did not want to de-interlace whatsoever. And that is the thing, some of Saturn's best games, including Virtua Fighter 2, do run in 480i, not 240p. When you're actually playing them on a flat panel or for capture, you do get a little bit of an interlacing line. Where back in the day, if you're on a CRT television, you'd have no idea whatsoever anything was interlaced, because that's how the broadcast standard worked, and the TVs, when they drew with that raster pattern, alternating those lines, your brain would never be able to really perceive it. That's one of those things. I do want to see more graphical enhancements come into Ymir, maybe in line with DuckStation, because I want higher internal running resolutions for the polygons, and maybe even some stuff like widescreen support if the games can actually support it. I know it's a pipe dream, we might get it, we might not, but it's definitely something that I think would get a lot more people involved in Sega Saturn. But if you haven't tested Ymir yet, if you haven't tried it out, you can't stress out enough just how good this thing truly is. Second soundtrack sample, I'll be right back with more. Definitely a very playable Virtua Fighter 2 experience, and honestly the controls feel every bit as good as they need to, because if there was too much latency between the time that you pressed a button on your controller and the action happened in-game, especially in a fighting game, you would be able to feel it and you wouldn't have a fun time. And this is really great because for the longest time, Sega Saturn Emulation lagged behind every other platform out there, down to just how complicated and a little bit weird the dual SH2 and VDP1 and VDP2 architectures were on the Sega Saturn. But in 2026, you can download something like Ymir and play like 98% of every Sega Saturn game ever made and have a very fun time. Now don't get me wrong, MedDefend is still an incredible choice, especially if you have the graphical user interface, but I get so many comments with people just having issues setting MedDefend up and never really being successful with it, where everyone who has tried Ymir has told me that it is great and they basically got it working the first time. And that really is the thing about emulation. It doesn't just need to do a good job, it needs to do it in an easy manner. If the setup process is too complicated, it doesn't really matter how good your emulation is. Not many people are going to succeed with it, not many people are going to actually try it out. And that is not a knock against MedDefend. Obviously, the design ethos was always command line based, but in 2026, how many people really know how to go into the command line anymore? Sure, I do, but I do this channel and grew up with that sort of thing, but if you didn't, it's basically going to be an insta-fail. So if you want to try the most recent version of Ymir out, the GitHub link is in the description below. Go play some Sega Saturn games, go give this emulator a test drive, pun very much intended for Sonic R, and I'll see you guys next time. Hope you enjoyed the video. Bye-bye.